organizations, companies, cybersecurity experts, and trade associations around the world who are dedicated to promoting and defending the use of strong encryption around the world. We're a free-to-join organization and always looking for new members who are willing to join us in the fight for strong encryption. So for today's first session, we're here to talk about the issue of government hacking. For those of you who've been paying attention to the news, you may have seen that on Monday, news came out that Chinese hackers have been using a hacking tool produced by the NSA and the US government to hack other places around the world and possibly the United States government themselves. Government hacking is a big issue that's near constantly in the news and presents serious consequences for security, privacy, and trust on the internet. Today on our panel, we have four excellent experts on the topic. We've got Jennifer Granick, who is the Surveillance and Cybersecurity Counsel with the American Civil Liberties Union, union's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. In this role, she litigates, speaks, and writes about privacy, security, technology, and constitutional rights. Granick is also the author of American Spies, Modern Surveillance, Why You Should Care, and What to Do About It, which was published by the Cambridge Press and a winner of the 2016 Palmer Civil Liberties Prize. We also have Harlan Yu, who's the executive director of Upturn. Based in Washington, D.C., Upturn works at the intersection of social justice and technology to ensure that new technology reflects the interests and needs of those at the margins. He previously worked at Google in both engineering and public policy roles, and as a technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and at the US Department of Labor. We also have Mallory Nodal, who's the Chief Technology Officer at the Center for Democracy and Technology. She's also the co-chair of the Human Rights and Protocol Considerations Research Group of the Internet Research Task Force. She's also an advisor to the Freedom Online Coalition. Mallory takes a human rights, people-centered approach to technology implementation and cybersecurity policy advocacy. CDT is also a member of the steering committee of the Global Encryption Coalition. Last but not least is Dr. Sven Herpig. He's the Director for International Cybersecurity Policy at Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, which is a German think tank. And Sven's current focal areas include the attack surface of machine learning with regards to national security, geopolitical responses to cyber operations, government hacking, and vulnerability management. Sven also served as an expert on IT security for the Committee of Interior and Homeland of the German Parliament and for the European Study on Legal Frameworks for Hacking by Law Enforcement. So thank you all for joining this panel. Really looking forward to it. So before we jump into government hacking and the panel, I want to quickly go over what government hacking is and isn't and set a bit of a framework for our discussion about government hacking. So government hacking is really where governments or others on their behalf exploit existing vulnerabilities to gain access to communications or data. This is a really broad topic. And so there's some distinctions that I want to make before we get into talking about it. The first is differences in use case. Government hacking is used by different parts of governments and by different governments and used for different purposes. The first purpose is really in criminal investigation. So this is where they're looking for specific evidence to be used in a court of law. It's often more targeted, and I think Harlan will get into this later, but more often focused on devices. Then there's the other side, which is intelligence gathering. So this is being done by groups like the NSA in the United States, the National, and by the CIA and others in the United States who are doing more bulk data collection and looking for any data that they can find. And this is not specific data that would be used in a court of law. This would be used for intelligence for decision-making in government. The other key distinction is remote hacking or bulk hacking versus kind of targeted hacking of physical devices. By remote hacking, I'm talking about the use of exploits over the network to gain access to communications or data. So the type of attack, the hack that I mentioned earlier, where that was recently in the news, where the Chinese hackers were using an exploit over the internet to gain access to Windows devices, that is a remote exploit that's being used, a remote hack. On the other side are physical hacking, where you have to use a hacking tool to get access to a physical device, and you need to have possession of that device to do that, actual physical possession. And an example of that would be the gray key tool that governments and law enforcement use to gain access to iPhones and to bypass security on iPhones to hack into them. Both of these forms of government hacking have slightly different consequences, but a lot of the same issues apply. So really wanted to set that groundwork before we jump into the panel. So to start off our panel, I think I wanted to get some kind of background on how cybersecurity has changed on the internet in the last several years, and how the use of end-to-end encryption has changed in terms of apps and mobile networks, and how that could maybe affect the use of government hacking on the internet. And so for that, I think I'll first turn to Mallory.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what the technical community has done. Just as being aware that we're here to talk about government hacking, which I think is going to be really difficult actually for the technical community to solve. And I'll explain why I think that's true. So, after the Snowden revelations, this really precipitated a response from the technical community. I think folks were worried that the threat of mass surveillance was a real threat to the internet itself, which is different than I think the threat that certainly play together. And I think the things that we do see around, government interference in the larger internet infrastructure would, in some cases, be considered hacking, right? They're using protocols in ways that weren't intended and that sort of thing. And I can maybe get into some of those specifics a bit later. But again, on the track about the technical community's response to mass surveillance, it's, at the same time, you have the, at least in places like the Internet Engineering Task Force and others, where there's a strong focus on the end-to-end principle of network design, meaning that you want, things to happen at the edges, things to happen at the ends, right? And that the rest of it, which is really the internet itself, is functioning without regard for what may be happening at those endpoints. And I think that then end-to-end encryption is actually just the full expression of the end-to-end principle, meaning that not only does it not matter what kind of data is traversing the parts between the ends, but that information and that content is protected. It's encrypted, so only the ends can see it. So end-to-end encryption is the fulfillment of the end-to-end principle. And I think that we've seen since like mass government surveillance has become a thing with the help of private companies, to be frank, that there's been a lot of attempts to secure and make private various layers of the internet stack. So lately, what you see in the news around this sort of thing is around the DNS, the domain name system. It's sort of notoriously the last thing to become much more privacy friendly. It was considered metadata for a long time. It's no longer considered just metadata. It's something that our queries to look up domain names and the IP addresses of the domain names we're visiting is significant user data, and it needs to be done in a private way. So that's just to contextualize what we're seeing, sort of today. But again, this is. These sorts of frontiers are still a concern. So I mentioned before, we're seeing governments potentially using existing internet protocols to, I think, in a way, hack, unintended use. Kazakhstan is forcing folks to download security certificates that come from the government rather than, the trusted server in the way that SSL works. We're seeing that, I mean, China has done for a very long time, controlled the infrastructure from the top down such that it can insert itself in the middle of what would otherwise be private and secure communications. Russia is doing the same thing with its national DNS scheme. So it's, I think we should be concerned about these things. I don't know that it is the role of the technical community to necessarily create protocols that will protect the endpoints. And that's, I think, where others can come in, and just to make that, make that distinction that, once there's a target set, it's very difficult for a standard protocol to actually be able to address, that sort of thing. But I think we'll get into more details later. I don't want to take up too much time in the beginning with that.
Thanks for that, Mallory. And I think that's a really interesting point about protocols not being able to be used to protect those endpoints. And on that note, I want to switch to you, Harlan, to talk about some of the research that Upturn's done on what seems to be really endpoint hacking in the United States of mobile devices, and hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, let's talk about those endpoints. Yeah, so the work that I'll describe today, within the framework that Ryan just laid out, is focused on the criminal law level here in the United States, when law enforcement has physical possession of a mobile device, oftentimes a cell phone. So just to distinguish the aspect of government hacking that I'll be concentrating on. So last October, my colleagues and I published a report titled Mass Extraction. You can find it on our website, upturn.org. It's also linked to in the description of the panel. And in that report, what we did was we investigated how local law enforcement agencies here in the United States search people's mobile devices. Again, primarily cell phones and oftentimes upon arrest. In order to perform these searches, rather than officers just like thumbing through phones manually, officers will oftentimes connect people's devices to mobile device forensic tools, right? These are other devices that can do three things. First, they circumvent the security protections on the device to get into the device. Second, they can make a full forensic extraction and copy of usually all of the data on the phone, meaning all of the photos, text messages, contacts, emails, browsing history, you name it, right? Including, in some cases, deleted data or passwords that could potentially allow law enforcement to then log into other cloud accounts. And then third, with all of that information, these tools then provide law enforcement with advanced analytical capabilities, right, to search and to sift through all of that information. Now, these tools are being built by private industry and then sold or licensed to law enforcement agencies for a few $1,000s a pop. You might have heard of, Cellebrite or Graykey, as Ryan mentioned before, because they are, among the most commonly used tools here in the United States. These vendors are playing this persistent game of cat and mouse, with Apple, with Google, with other phone manufacturers, in order to exploit security vulnerabilities and to find workarounds to get into mobile phones. And historically, I think it's fair to say that, vendors have generally been winning that game. Grayshift, which is the company behind the tool Graykey, touts on their website right now that they can provide law enforcement with same-day access to the latest iOS devices in less than 1 hour. So I'm happy to say a little bit more later about the capabilities of these forensic extraction tools. But first, maybe just I'll share a little briefly about our research and our high-level findings from our recent research report. And so to do this research, we sent more than 110 public records requests to local and state law enforcement agencies across the United States, asking for a wide range of information about these practices, about what tools they've purchased, how they use the tools and what types of cases, whether they're getting warrants, and so on and so forth. And what we found was that every American is currently at risk of having their phone forensically searched by law enforcement. We documented at least 2,000 law enforcement agencies across the United States that have already purchased a range of products from these vendors, and law enforcement agencies in all 50 states and in DC already use them. We also found that law enforcement agencies here in the United States have performed hundreds of thousands of cell phone extractions since 2015, which is far more than I think was previously documented. And we believe that this is also still at the low end There's very little public data about this, and this is just what we've been able to document to date. So these tools are in widespread use right now in the United States. But what we also found in our research is that they're being used in routine everyday investigations. The records we collected show that law enforcement use these tools to investigate not only cases involving major harm like terrorism and CSAM, but also for really mundane cases like graffiti, shoplifting, marijuana possession, prostitution, vandalism, traffic crashes, petty theft, public intoxication, and the full gamut of drug-related offenses. And so just to underscore, how routine these searches are today, and given what we know about racist policing practices here in the United States, it's more than likely that these technologies disparately affect and are being used against communities of color here in the United States. And so I think these findings are particularly salient to the debate about encryption and backdoors in at least two ways. First, I think the language and narrative that's driven by law enforcement is that it needs quote unquote exceptional or extraordinary access to digital devices. Focusing again on terrorism and CSAM. But I think it's clear from our research that any new capabilities that are eventually given to law enforcement, if they're given, will quickly be used for all sorts of everyday minor offenses at the local and state levels. And I think secondly, and it's a really simple point, which is that law enforcement already has the capabilities necessary to successfully get into the vast majority of devices, including high-end iPhones and Android devices. And so I'll just pause there for now, and happy to share more throughout this panel.
Thanks, Erlen. And when I read your report, one of the things that struck me is I live in a small town in rural Virginia, and about 20 miles north of my town is a town of 10,000 people, and their police department has one of these tools. It's a town of 10,000 people and they have this tool. And so that really struck home how widespread this is, that a town of 10,000 people with a small local police department has their hands on one of these tools to use, which is just completely wild to me. So going more to the federal level in the United States, I know the ACLU has filed a lawsuit against the FBI on their capabilities and their hacking capabilities. Jennifer, could you tell us more about that lawsuit and what the ACLU has been working on more at the federal level on government hacking?
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. First, I want to just tell a little bit of story, which I think illustrates exactly what Harlan is talking about. This is a case that we are about to file an amicus brief in the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. And in this case, the defendant was being investigated for a hit and run. And as part of the hit and run, the officer asked if they could take a look at his phone. They took the phone, they did a full forensic download of the copy, and eventually cleared the man from suspicion in the hit and run. But they still had the data, which was all the data on the phone. And a couple of months later, he became a suspect in a different crime. And then they were able to search all of this cell phone data for evidence in this separate second investigation, because they had so much and they could keep it around, and storage is so cheap. So I think that's just a perfect example of how in a very run-of-the-mill type case, all your information can be exposed to the police. And we really don't have much information about how it's kept, retained, when it's deleted, if ever, and what the rules are for the government or police and agencies to be able to access it. And this level of kind of chaos and secrecy is true at the federal level, maybe even more so, Ryan. It's very hard inside the United States to figure out exactly what the government is doing with regards to hacking. And that is because there is this shroud of secrecy, which surrounds the issues of when are they using, what are their capabilities with regards to unlocking phones? When are they using network investigative techniques, which is one of the terms, in order to unmask people who are on the Tor network? What are the capabilities for delivering malware to people? What was the use of social engineering? And so we've tried to file these Freedom of Information Act requests to get this information. And very often weeks or months or years go by and we haven't gotten the information. So we have to sue in order to find out what that is. So we have a couple of efforts to get through the secrecy and try to find out, A, what's really going on, and B, what is the law even that governs the government's ability to use these tools. And we've gotten pushback on knowing both those things, not only how the technology works, but also what are the rules and what's permitted. So in one of our cases, we're asking for information about one of the FBI's apparently several sub-organizations that's able to do extraction of data from devices, and trying to find out what is this organization. It's called the EDAU. In another one of our lawsuits, we've asked for information. We, along with Privacy International, have asked for information about what various agencies' capabilities and efforts are with regards to obtaining hacking capabilities. And in a third case, which we ended up losing, we asked for information about a request or a demand that the FBI made to Facebook to do something to change encryption on voice over Facebook Messenger to facilitate wiretapping and surveillance in a particular investigation. So as I mentioned, for the last case, we lost that case. The other two FOIA lawsuits are ongoing, and we're learning a couple of interesting things. And one of the things we're learning is that there is a lot of interest on the part of the executive agencies in getting access to hacking tools. So our lawsuit has revealed that the Drug Enforcement Agency has looked for and has even made purchases from some of these private exploit vendor companies, and that there is a lot of interagency cooperation and discussion about, basically leveraging the capabilities that a sub-agency like the DEA has in order to facilitate hacking or other kinds of surveillance activities by other agencies. And so, and some of the documents that we found have also been about thinking about how to expand the jurisdiction of agencies which are charged, which have hacking capabilities and which are really charged for foreign intelligence type purposes, and expand their mission so that they're capable of and authorized to help other agencies on domestic law enforcement and regular criminal investigations. So, this is something that we see often with surveillance and policing, which is that the technology starts developed in the military context, and then trickles down into serious crimes and then into everyday crimes. And I think that's something that we're seeing here too, where as Harlan mentioned, even for some very routine types of investigations, you're seeing basically hacking, like find out who sent a threat at a school, to which a student sends a threat at a school, to find out which one it is. You send a Trojan in a website that's a fake website that's a news story about the school closing, and that Trojan basically grabs information from the student's computer and delivers it to the police to find out who it is. So you're seeing this in, we're not talking about major drug investigations or terrorism or that sort of thing. But ultimately, here in the United States, we're really at a disadvantage because there is this really, curtain of secrecy that prevents people from knowing what technology is being purchased, which of these shady private vendors the United States government is sending our taxpayer money to and doing business with, what the rules of engagement are, and what the outcome is in terms of how the information that's gathered is eventually used.
That's really, really interesting. And I think it's really interesting also in the context of kind of militarization of the police force, because I know that's a broader conversation in the US right now politically, but thinking about it in terms of these tools that would be used in foreign intelligence now being used domestically is just a really interesting angle that I had never thought of before. So going from the US to the European context, Sven, in Germany, are we seeing much the same trend, or is there differences in how government hacking is being done in Germany, in the German context?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think being German here, I will go through our structures, institutions, and processes in no less than 60 minutes. No, but let me briefly walk you through our history, because we have a very well-developed framework for remote targeted government hacking operations that has been developed for more than a decade now. And it very much evolved during that time, and it's still being driven forward as we speak. There are 3 new legal amendments on the table right now, which we are going to be passed this year. Currently, only federal and state criminal police is legally allowed to engage in this activity, also targeted remote government hacking operations. And even though the numbers that we have just been released last week are extremely low, so we are talking low double digits, and they have been primarily used in property crimes and drug investigations. So as Harlan said, we are not seeing it in terrorist investigations or murder or manslaughter cases. We are seeing it in property crimes, in money laundering, in drug investigations, in tax evasion, that kind of stuff. The funny thing is that our federal police had to announce that they haven't used any remote targeted government hacking in a successful investigation since 2017. So let that sink in. So we created this great legal framework for them to not use it. So currently we have 2 kinds legally defined of remote government hacking. We have online search, which would allow for full take of the device, all data on the device remotely. It was first limited to cases of emergency response, risk of death, and international terrorism, but has since 2017 been expanded through a legal amendment to cover 27 serious crimes where it is allowed to be used. And we have what we call source wiretapping, where government agencies can only tap the ongoing communications. So after the time of the compromise or the breach of the device with government hacking software, they can record communications going forward from that point onwards. It is now being applied, or legally being allowed to be applied, in more than 38 serious crimes, including treason, sedition, money laundering, tax evasion, fraudulent application of asylum. So you see where this is going. The limitations, so of course we have safeguards. Limitations to these powers are, of course, you need a warrant, which need to be approved by a judge. Unless there's urgency or immediate danger, then a prosecutor's office can first approve it. The data collection cannot touch the core area of private life. And if data is collected within that frame, then it has to be deleted and cannot be used in court. And it needs the government hacking operation needs to be investigated under the crimes that I just mentioned, under the list of crimes. But not only that, Germany also has set up an institutional infrastructure, a centralized institutional infrastructure to support government hacking by establishing the Central Office for Information Technology in the Security Domain, or CITES for short. That office is tasked with providing all the police and intelligence agencies that are allowed to conduct these operations with training, research, and procurement of government hacking tools, as well as big data analysis, forensics, and other things. So it's really centralized, and the plan is that all the police and intelligence agencies soon will have to go through that agency. It's a one-stop shop for everything government hacking. But we have also a couple of other things on the table right now, as I mentioned, and not only will it enable, if it passes, and it's likely to pass, it will enable all 18 German intelligence agencies to conduct remote targeted government hacking. Right now, it's still limited to the police agencies. There's another legal amendment on the table which will allow security agencies to compel internet service providers to deliver the malware or the government hacking software of intelligence agencies to the device of their customers. And there's also legal amendments on the table right now that will invent 2 additional kinds of remote targeted government hacking. One is called source wiretapping light. So it will, yeah, it's not so light actually. It will allow, it's the same thing as source wiretapping, so only ongoing communications, but ongoing communications not starting with the time of the breach of the device by the government agency, but starting or backtracking to the date that the warrant was approved. And then there's another kind, which is called preventive source wiretapping. And of course, that will enable the federal police to use source wiretapping before a crime has been committed. So in case, for example, of trying to prevent organized crime to do certain operations. And lastly, how do we connect that to the EU level? Unfortunately, I have to say, Germany had the Council presidency last year, second part of last year in the European Council, and they put forward a resolution that aims at regulating encryption. The interesting thing in that resolution is that it has the same wording as our 1999 crypto principles. And these principles basically can be condensed down to security through encryption and security despite of encryption, which sounds really weird. But in the end of the day, it meant we're not going to touch secure encryption as a government, but we are going to allow our agencies to conduct remote targeted government hacking. So even though right now on the EU level, we are all talking about bringing regulating encryption to the EU level, if you look at the language, it actually looks more like Germany is pushing for a EU-wide legislative framework on remote targeted government hacking. But we'll see where this is going. Apparently, the Portuguese European Council presidency, which is right now, is not so keen on pushing this further. So we're going to see, starting from summer onwards, if that gets any traction and where we're going to go with that on the EU level. Thank you.
Thanks, Sven. And that is the beauty of 6-month rotating presidency at the European Council. Can't get all that much done, which is okay when it's bad ideas. So there was a follow-up question in the chat from Lori R. Asking if you'd be able to go into more detail about what the quote core of private life covers. And this actually leads me to my kind of next question, which is, are there concerns about the utility or constitutionality of this data to be used in court, for instance? Are law enforcement taking too much data? Are they messing up this data when they take it in a way that will make this not useful in court? And so I think we'll first go to Sven, but maybe then Jennifer or Harlan, you could jump in after that.
Thank you so much. It's kind of defined as things like such as the bedroom, for example, where it's meant to cover to protect the intimate and privacy core of your life. And you can imagine in what way this is going. This is one part, and of course the usage is also limited, as I said before, to certain crimes, even though the list is very long, and it has been permanently and constantly challenged in the Constitutional Court, every part of our legal framework. And we had a landmark ruling in 2007 by the Constitutional Court, which put the boundaries to it that we see right now. But also the other outcome was that it defines the confidentiality and the integrity of IT devices of Germans in general as a fundamental right. And this is quite interesting because this is the basis for all the constitutional court cases that we've seen, or most of them that we've seen afterwards, against the government hacking and government hacking legal framework, because it was surprising that the Constitutional Court actually said, okay, well, we are living in an information society, and the confidentiality and the integrity of your IT devices and the data and your everything you have there is actually be treated as a fundamental right that puts these hard boundaries there, even though, of course, there's always a bit of wiggle space, what that actually means.
Thanks, Sven. Jennifer or Harlan, would you have anything to say on kind of the utility of this data?
I'll just say a few things about how secrecy impacts the use of information that comes from some kind of government hacking. So for example, one issue that we've seen, and this is in the context of the government's investigation of torrent and Tor networks that are often used to trade CSAM, child abuse material. And one of the issues there, they use a technique they call a NIT, network investigative technique. And one of the issues there is whether the NIT is accurate in terms of when it identifies a IP address and associates it with illegal content. Since the technique is something the government's wanted to keep secret, there's a clash with the defendant's due process rights to learn about, what the actual technology does, whether the technology is reliable, and whether the way that the technology collects information is consistent with the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable searches and seizures. And so there have been battles in the courts over what the government has to reveal to the defendant in order to be able to rely on information from one of these tools. And in most cases, the courts have let the government go without, full disclosure of the details of the way that the NIT works. But there have been a few cases where the court said, look, the defendant needs to know about this in order to fairly be able to raise a defense. And the government has dismissed the case instead of making that disclosure. Another big issue that we are seeing that we're doing a lot of litigation as amicus, friend of the court, in is with this issue of how forensic tools, that are designed to extract data from cell phones and other devices interact with, again, the Fourth Amendment's right against unreasonable searches and seizures, and whether the way that these tools work is consistent with the basic principle of the Fourth Amendment, that police shouldn't just be randomly rummaging through all of your private stuff. And sort of trying to figure out where these tools are an impediment to that, and where these tools can actually maybe provide some sort of benefit by narrowing down what searches could actually look like. So those are two areas in which we see the impact of this technology and these tools directly, in conversations about what it looks like to use them in the criminal justice system.
And so just to expand on that, and Jennifer, actually being a lawyer is way better position to speak on this than I am. But, my main concern is, how few legal limits there actually are to using these tools. Based on our research and the records we've collected, in some jurisdictions, a large fraction of the searches that are being done are based on consent, right? Or quote unquote consent, which basically means that there's no judicial oversight and very few limits on what officers and law enforcement can do with the data once they're obtained. Even in cases where there is a warrant, these warrants are crafted and written in a way that are extremely broad, right? You might have a particular crime happening at a particular time, but these warrants are not narrowly targeted. Oftentimes they, will just ask for the extraction of the entire phone. These warrant applications are almost always approved by magistrate judges without further limitations. Oftentimes these are often also approved digitally, which means that they can come back in 30 minutes or an hour. And so just to say that, even with warrants, we kind of see that just as a mere speed bump, because oftentimes we just don't see further limits placed on what law enforcement's asking for. It just requires a little bit more paperwork on the part of law enforcement to get that one.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there have been a couple of courts which have held that once you have the warrant, police can open and examine manually basically every file on the phone, because the idea is that, how else will they know what, whether a file is relevant to the crime or not relevant to the crime? And that's just technologically not correct. That is completely inefficient in terms of the use of police data, but it has ended up with police being like, oh, this file sounds interesting, let's check and see what's here. So even with a warrant, we're really litigating and fighting for that to mean something. more at the stage that the warrant is issued, and also more at the stage of how the warrant manages to regulate the way the search is conducted to protect the vast majority of information on the phone, which is innocent. And also, I'll point out, involves other people, third parties who the phone owner is communicating with, who are also completely uninvolved in whatever the investigation is about.
That's a really good point, and I can imagine that the magistrate judges who are going over these warrants and approving them probably don't know much about these tools that are going to be used to get this information. So, looking at we have government hacking being used and being used heavily in some parts of the world, like in the US. I want to turn now to what the consequences are from government hacking on security, privacy, and even society more generally that we're seeing, and how these consequences might differ around the world. And so I think I'll first turn to Mallory on this to give your view on what the consequences are of government hacking.
Sure, and I think there are a few ways to answer this. I mean, and it maybe goes to a specific question that was in the Q&A from Michael Nelson about, when the NSA sort of had, the standards bodies adopt weak encryption so they could crack the code later. I think those kinds of things really undermine a lot. It's putting everybody at risk for sometimes small targets. And it's not weighing other conflicting issues in the public interest. And that's something that we obviously care a lot about, because there's a lot of impact potentially when the hacking is done over the network. So as opposed to police officer with a phone in their hand trying to get into it, when there's a target that is maybe identified, and then as in the law in Germany, the sort of payload is delivered over the internet, or the exploit is used for remote hacking, that has implications because there are other adversaries that may be able to do the same kind of exploit. It just exposes a lot, and it isn't so very targeted anymore. So, but I think the broader question is just that it undermines the idea of trust. We need the internet to go to school, to go to work, to talk to our doctors and our lovers and everyone else. And then we are supposed to be able to do those things to, live our lives, as Sven was saying, the core of our personal lives. But we're also meant to do business and other things that are really important for our economies. And, we've noticed the sort of international bodies that are meeting online and the ones that aren't, because of the risk of compromise. And that's notable, right? That tells us something, that there certainly are things that need to happen on the internet that are, or through telecommunications, that are secure. And knowing that there's this history, there's these receipts that we have where governments are trying to have it both ways, it really undermines that to a degree that is very concerning. And I just want to again just hammer home the difference between really using the core of the network or internet connectivity at all to level to level attacks against specific targets, and doing it at the endpoint specifically. I think those are two hugely different things that we need to make a big distinction between.
Thanks, Mallory. Others? The question was on consequences of the on security and privacy of government hacking. Just to,
could I add to that a little bit, Ryan, since somebody's ready to chime in? Yeah, I just want to also answer another question that I think is a little bit related around proposals around traceability and end-to-end encryption, just as a way to maybe parse through this and think through how small or targeted uses have broader effects. So the idea that traceability of messages in end-to-end encrypted systems really doesn't break encryption. So what is the problem? I think we have to think bigger about that from a systems perspective. Often end-to-end encryption systems, we're not really just talking about the cryptography that allows for messages to be secure. We're talking about how the whole how the whole system works. It really is a system. It's a system of authenticating one's identity, of being able to have data secured today that remains secured tomorrow, or if you're able to get access to one message, you're not able to get access to all of the messages. That's called forward secrecy. And there are other features that end-to-end encrypted systems are really trying to incorporate to do their best to keep confidential conversations confidential between the endpoints that are very much undermined by these extraneous features. So what traceability really is like enhanced metadata of a message. It's often useful and requested by law enforcement because they already have the content of the message, right? So the local police they've done a really good job of asking users if they see bad content or they see questionable things to forward it to law enforcement. So typically we're assuming that, they already have the content. What they want is enhanced metadata to know where the message has come from and who else has seen it along the way, and to be able to use that enhanced metadata to build a case or to introduce something in court and that sort of thing. And so again, it's part of a larger system. It's bigger than a backdoor. And that is why it would have maybe unintended consequences if it were built into end-to-end encrypted messaging systems beyond just like one target. Everybody would then have that vulnerability. And so it's really incompatible with confidential communications as a feature.
So I'll just add to, I think, Mallory, your point is super important because sometimes we think about end-to-end encryption as like, that's the thing to protect and kind of miss out on the point about, or the importance of security on the network as a whole, and that security can be delivered through a variety of different technologies that may or may not fit within the, strict definition of end-to-end encryption. I want to talk a little bit about some of the economic and policy risks from government hacking. And I think in my field, these are underrepresented and not really addressed by the requirement that there be a warrant, because these are concerns that are outside of the scope of that sort of privacy interest. And I want to raise the problem I mentioned briefly about the private sector's development and sales of malware. And we've seen, and I think everybody who's interested in this topic knows about the work that Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto does, basically investigating and tracking the way that malware from particular companies is used often by governments, often against journalists, human rights activists, and other advocates in order to conduct spying. And, one of the problems with the United States government's interest in this area is that when you do business with an organization or a company like Hacking Team, which the Drug Enforcement Agency has bought some kind of technology from, you're basically cultivating and participating in this market for surveillance tools. And the market itself is pretty shady. There's not much regulation of these companies. They are not really answerable to human rights standards. And you're supporting a network that gets a benefit from insecurity and incentivizes insecurity over security, insecurity to basically address the minority of issues. It takes precedence over security for for everyone else on the network, which is a huge disadvantage and creates a giant risk for innocent users, as well as for the organizations like Mallory mentioned, that need secure communications over the network to operate to operate properly. So I think that's another underappreciated part of the equation, that you have an incentive and you promote a market that are destructive when government hacking is underregulated.
Go ahead, Sven.
All right. And these are only the consequences that we're looking at when we look at the legitimate use of government hacking. And then I think we also have to extend it to look at the abuse of for example, remote targeted government hacking. If you look at smartphones, for example, our entire life is on there, right? And if you look at what I mentioned before, source wiretapping, so you can record ongoing communications from then on. So you can record all the communications. If you have the other kind, you can get all the data on the device. But that's not all. You also have all the sensors on the device. You have camera, you have microphone, and so far, and you can record all that data. That's a huge pile of data. So, and then let's look at the illegitimate use of it, because powers that are granted to government agencies are not rarely abused, exploited by individuals within the ranks of those agencies, and then they can lead to create great problems. We have seen in Snowden revelations how the tools of the NSA were misused, and I'm pretty sure that they are also misused now when we're looking at government hacking tools. And if you look at the power that these tools have and the data that we have on those devices, and that we can collect on those devices while the hacking operation is ongoing, this is a huge problem if abused. Also, if not abused, it's a huge problem, as we've seen. But if it's abused, then I think it comes to staggering proportions. And that's something we should and we have to be aware of when we talk about the legitimate use of it as well.
Yeah, and I can weigh in a little bit on what I see as some of the social and community consequences of government hacking. Right? I think like the debate on encryption backdoors is oftentimes framed as, somewhat of a stalemate, right? Like a decades-long stalemate on backdoors. But I think from like the community perspective, things really look quite different, and it's not really a stalemate, right? The recent adoption of these mobile device forensic tools, we see as a dangerous expansion of law enforcement's investigatory power. These are pretty new, that devices that law enforcement have been adopting over the last 5 or 10 years. Pair that with the amount of sensitive information that's now stored on people's smartphones over the last 5 or 10 years as well, right? One expert, we put this in our report. One expert called this, cell phones a window into our soul, which is what law enforcement can now get access to. And the consequence of this rapid expansion and adoption of these tools and practices is that it's going to further exacerbate the problems of mass incarceration in the United States, right? It's also going to continue to perpetuate the racially discriminate harms of our current criminal legal system. So I think it's just vital for policymakers, particularly here in the United States, to consider these consequences and to elevate these concerns as well, because I certainly don't think that they get enough attention in the current encryption debate.
That's a really good point. And it's really interesting to hear kind of how the consequences are bad, even if they're used correctly. So even if they're used, well, correctly, I should say, in quotes, correctly from the law enforcement perspective, but then how also there's bad consequences with them being, I'd consider, misused, where if you have hacking team and others in the private sector who are selling these tools to non-rule of law countries or to other private individuals who might be using this for nefarious reasons. And so it's really interesting to me to hear that both if it's used correctly and used incorrectly, they're going to be bad consequences, at least that you see. And so thinking of those consequences, what can we do to change this? Are there safeguards that we can put in place that we can be advocating for as a community to help limit these negative consequences from government hacking? Or is there nothing we can do, and is government hacking just going to happen? And I'm leaving this up to anyone to jump in on it.
Well, I'll just say a couple of things. First of all, I think we have to stop pretending that there's a trade-off between encryption backdoors and government hacking as a policy matter. Our government's going to push for both, as well as other means of using technology to conduct surveillance. So I think we need to, kind of step out of the which do we hate more, and, realize that each of, encryption backdoors pose serious risks. Government hacking poses serious risks. Forcing companies to undermine security on their products poses serious risks, and deal with those, as they come, as they are. I think, another important thing to think about is about the kind of trickle down problem. Obviously, if the NSA loses control of its exploits and they're, repurposed for ransomware attacks, that's terrible. And also, it's the NSA. Think about that when we're talking about, state or local law enforcement. I'm not sure that the San Francisco Police Department is in any better position, is in any kind of position to protect exploits that it might use. So limiting the use to, the extent possible and trying to prevent some of that trickle down from military and intelligence uses into the criminal justice system, I think is another thing, to look at. I think certainly documenting and having more information available about the global market for malware, about how it's used in the criminal justice system, about making tools, that are going to be used for criminal investigations accessible to experts for testing, and really trying to, not hide the technology behind a veil of secrecy, I think would be really important as well.
So let me connect to Jennifer's first point, because I think that's a great point. I think we need a comprehensive empirical study that there's actually a necessity and about the effectiveness of remote targeted government hacking, because I haven't seen one. There's always claims like, okay, now we need remote government hacking, now we need encryption backdoors, but there's never really the empirical evidence or sound empirical evidence that any of that is needed, or that there are less intrusive ways to get the same quality of evidence. So it's always a narrative being pushed about going dark, and when actually we might actually, how I think Peter Swire said it also, in the golden age of surveillance. So we should look at that if the evidence is already out there, if we even actually need government hacking, which I actually doubt to a certain degree. But even if we can't do that, even if we find that this is necessary, maybe we should look at limiting it to non-remote targeted government hacking, so on-device government hacking, because that already rules out certain kind of dangers. So, but if we can't rule out limiting it to non-remote government hacking, then we should look at not allowing 0 days or unknown vulnerabilities being used in remote targeted government hacking operations, because them not being disclosed makes the entire internet ecosystem more fragile and dangerous place. So if targeted government hacking has to be done remotely, then it should be limited maybe to known to N days vulnerabilities. And the next point, and two more points I want to make quickly. One is, it was mentioned already before, is we should have binding requirements for vendors of government hacking tools on the basis of their track records regarding their other clients' human rights violations. So basically, vendors selling knowingly to countries, to government entities that are known for human rights violations, then our governments shouldn't be allowed to buy the tools from them. And then my last point is transparency reporting. I know it's maybe not much, but it's nice because we have just gotten some transparency reporting the last 2 weeks here in Germany. And as I mentioned before, it really helped us to understand how many times these tools are actually used, and they are used in a very, very low double-digit number. So that also gives you already some evidence to go on and some data to debate this further.
I think the points that I would highlight that I've already raised are making a distinction between what is an attack on the core of the internet. And I know there's been some progress made with trying to set global norms around what is the core of the internet, trying to define that very clearly, and then trying to influence governments that are making high-level decisions about what is fair game and what isn't, and really protecting that core, so that we're not seeing standard internet protocols weak, or using the core of the network to deliver essentially malware to residents and that sort of thing. That should just really be off limits. So I think that's a really important one. Another thing that I think we should be worried about is what is considered private messaging and end-to-end encryption is starting to become a little muddy. So again, we have these concerns around feature requests like traceability or client-side scanning. And we didn't get into all of those things, but we need to just be sure that these features aren't still considered to be viable end-to-end encrypted messaging when they really are not. And the definitions are going to start to get murkier and murkier to where, it's very clear that users want, or that people really want the ability to whisper online, to be in confidential conversations on WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, iMessage, et cetera, they all have moved to end-to-end encryption. At the same time, though, if just one or two major platforms then aren't implementing these strong protocols, these strong protections, then we have a differential of privacy amongst, regular folks and then people who are savvy enough to go to a really encrypted app. And we don't want that to happen. So I think we have to fold in clear definitions of what users really and people really want from a technical perspective, and then also then make sure that private companies know that that's what, and they feel empowered to maintain the highest security for end users that they can. So, thanks.
And so maybe just going from the messaging sphere back to the on-device sphere. To Ryan's point, your point earlier about, there are harms when these tools are misused, but lots of harms too when they are being used, right? Ultimately, we believe that these mobile device forensic tools are simply too powerful in the hands of law enforcement, and that they shouldn't be used. The first step in limiting the use of these tools, at least one step, is to ban the use of consent searches when it comes to these tools. Consent searches, I put that in quotes because almost no one actually believes that consent searches are truly voluntary, right? They're terribly coercive in nature when somebody is being asked by a law enforcement officer. And so it's just far too easy and far too easily abused, I think, as a legal avenue to conduct a search. So working potentially legislatively to cut out those searches would be at least one straightforward first step.
Thanks, Harlan, and everyone for that. That's really interesting. Actually, I see a follow-up question from Olaf in the chat to you, Mallory, could you explain why you don't want that differentiation?
I think Olaf means the differentiation between just private messaging and then end-to-end encrypted messaging. I guess what I'm concerned about is that we've benefited from large consolidated internet providers like Facebook and Apple to provide solid end-to-end encryption in their messaging for everyone, for lots and lots of people. And so, of course, then that makes them an attractive target for weakening encryption globally. Right, you'll reach lots of users with sort of weakened encryption and so on and so forth. I think that could happen, right? It could be maybe not leveled by law, or could be, I just think that the converse can also then be true, where the majority of folks are sort of satisfied by an idea of private messaging that from a technical perspective is flawed. And because it's really sort of deep in the weeds, the difference between, an end-to-end encrypted system with, traceability, client-side scanning, and all those things that we're worried about, it's going to sound arcane. It's going to be a really difficult thing to explain, the difference between this one versus that one. And I don't think we want to get to that point, because I think the technical explanation heavy conversation would lose out on the convenience and the availability of it with everyone else. I think, we need to head it off in the past so that we don't have a situation in which all these apps over here are sort of private messaging, sort of, it's good enough for you. And then these are the ones that are solidly end-to-end encrypted, because if you're really trying to commit crimes and be confidential, you would maybe be savvy enough to move to those, whereas everyone else is sort of left with the not as good one. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Mallory. So moving to some of the questions from the audience, we have one question from Marilee asking, how can citizens defend themselves from these hacking tools? Are there things that people can do, and will taking those actions to keep yourself safe actually make you a bigger target for government hacking? So I'm wondering if anyone's run into seen actions that people can do to keep themselves safe, or I don't know, Harlan, in your research, seen where people have tried to protect their phones from forensic tools. Does anyone have anything on that? Or can we not protect ourselves? Is that the answer?
Well, I can only speak for the targeted remote government hacking operations, and for that you basically do the same things that you do to protect yourself from criminals. You update your phone, you update your computer, you use security software, you don't click on fishy links, all of that. But basically the same cyber hygiene that you normally need to do to keep yourself safe from criminals.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I think sadly there might not be much that people can't do. Even if you're rich enough to afford the latest iPhone or a high-end Android device, these tools can get into it. So, really, it shouldn't be on the user or on individuals to have to do this, right? What I'm looking for are structural changes that will protect folks across the board.
Thanks, Harlan. That's a really good point. Is maybe the best protection we have is the safeguards that we can put in place. So I have one more question, and this one was directed at Jennifer, asking how can we avoid ex-NSA analysts or I'm sure analysts from other government agencies going to work for companies that develop sophisticated remote surveillance tools and then might sell those to other countries or to nefarious actors?
So this is a super difficult question for me personally, because I spent so much of my career representing computer hackers who, basically are researchers who find 0 days, who publicize them, who, want to get paid for highly skilled, really important work. And, I have an immense amount of loyalty that lies with that community and also with that kind of intellectual, academic, and economic freedom. On the other hand, as a civil libertarian and a, person who's really concerned with human rights, I look at what the market looks like now and the investigations that Citizen Lab does and tracking the use of malware and how it's being deployed against journalists and activists by various oppressive governments, and seeing what that market looks like. And I think that that's just untenable. So personally, it's very difficult for me to kind of, go between those two things. I do think that I do think the market's not working. I think it's really shady. And I think that the way that companies are immunized effectively from the ramifications of who uses their tools and to what harm for these, whether they be activists or journalists or whatever, I think that is a serious problem, because there's no corporate responsibility that's imposed upon these companies, and that's something there needs to change. And how you effectuate that change isn't entirely clear to me, whether it's through carefully crafted export controls, whether it's through civil liability, whether it's through, the same kinds of tools we use for, keeping munitions out of the hands of entities that we feel like will abuse them. There, I really don't know what the answer is, but I do think that, it's an untenable situation, and figuring out how to address it while still, valuing the things that got me into technology and law from the very beginning is, hard.
So we're not going to solve it on this call, but maybe the next.
I'm not going to solve it on this call. Maybe others will solve it on this call.
Do any of the others want to weigh in on this one? Okay, so now moving on to a new question that just came in. And Sven, I might turn to you for this one, since Europe has stronger data protection authorities than the US, unsurprisingly. And so the question is from Kaliwe, asking, do data protection authorities have a role to play in ensuring accountability and transparency in surveillance by law enforcement?
Very good question. So I think I can't really answer that. The only thing I can answer from the German perspective is, of course, that the data protection agencies have the mandate to investigate our law enforcement agencies in their use of tools, but also in adhering to data protection guidelines. So there are investigations that can happen, and reports to be written, blame to be shared. But that's as far as I can go in answering that question.
Thanks, Sven. Any others want to weigh on this, or no? Okay. So I think we'll move to our last question, or two questions, and then head to kind of your final word on this before we close out the panel with a few words from Greg about the Global Encryption Coalition. And these are two related questions from Aristoteles and Joseph in the questions. And those are there standards with regards to verifying the forensic integrity of evidence gathered by these techniques? And a related question of at what phase of litigation do most of these fights over hacked data tend to happen? And does law enforcement produce evidence that they used these tactics to get access to this evidence?
Harlan, do you want to address this one based on what you've seen with your report, or do you want me to give it a shot?
I mean, I think just very briefly on the standards question, I know that NIST has published guidelines on the use of mobile device forensic tools. Law enforcement does talk a lot about, in terms of training officers, in terms of integrity in using these tools. But I certainly think it should be possible to have things, to the extent that phones are being searched, that there is integrity while limiting the scope of the search, right? And not just having to extract the entire contents of a phone in order to maintain integrity.
I can talk a little bit about what it looks like from inside a criminal investigation. You will get, as the defense attorney, warrant application if it's involved with a warrant, or you'll get, in discovery, you may get a report, and that report may be like all of the data from the phone, or it may be showing you what the police. Oh, I'm muted. You guys didn't hear anything I said. Is that right?
We caught the very beginning and then muted a few times.
I don't know how that happened. I'm sorry about that. From inside an investigation, I think, just to kind of sum up, you have a real sophistication and control of the data on one side, on the side of the prosecution, and you have a varying level of sophistication and access to resources on the defense side. The attorney may or may not be familiar with this technology. They may or may not have been told very much about it. They may or may not be able to find an expert. These companies like Celebrate and Gray Key do trainings for law enforcement, but they do not make the products available to defense attorneys or to outsiders. There are trade secret laws that are used to protect the technology from independent examination, or even claims of classification that keep the tools out of public scrutiny. And there are ways that we've seen where tools of surveillance are hidden from defense attorneys and sometimes from courts through sort of obfuscated language, because the government does not want there to be this level of public scrutiny. So we really don't have, as I said before, a real picture about how government hacking tools are being used, or necessarily how they work. The more common they are, like the mobile device forensic tools or the NITs that I mentioned earlier, the more opportunities there are for some defense attorney to come and talk about it. But we have seen with tools like devices like Stingrays, in order to locate cell phones or other types of tools, where we really haven't had even early cell site data. We really haven't had until much after the tools being used frequently and a lot, we really don't necessarily get that kind of judicial or public scrutiny of it. And there's a practice called parallel construction, which we see with some, in some cases where information is obtained through some kind of technological surveillance, but then kind of a different path towards that information is created so that when the defendant or the defense attorney asks, how did you find out this? The discovery or the investigators can say, well, we found it out this way, when really they found it out this other way that they don't want to talk about.
That's disturbing to hear. It really makes you feel bad about the criminal legal system in the US.
I mean, and it does effectively insulate some of these techniques from judicial review.
That's a really good point. Mallory or Sven, would you want to jump in on this, or? Yeah, okay. So I think we're getting close to the end of our time for the panel. And I'm going to ask kind of a two-parter, which is the first being, don't governments already have enough when we have this larger encryption debate around encryption backdoors? It seems like governments, like Harlan was saying, already have like a staggering amount of access to information that itself warrants a conversation about safeguards and policy concerns. But now we have governments asking for encryption backdoors and undermining the security of users. And so I think as kind of the final word and this question, what are your views on how the debate around government hacking fits into the larger, or should be fitting into the larger debate around encryption backdoors? And then also, if there's anything that the audience should take away from this this panel, what should it be at the end of this session? Let's go first with Jennifer.
Well, I'll first say, I think, so with regards to encryption backdoors, I think a couple of things. Number one is, I think that the phrases extraordinary access or exceptional access are lies. What we see is that, the access will not be either extraordinary or exceptional. It will become routine. I think the second thing that's a lie is lawful access, because, lawful access suggests that the only way that the security weakness will be exploited is by legitimate legal actors, and not criminals or governments that do not have, that don't live up to human rights standards, and implies that the law or the legal regime is sufficient to protect the interests that people have in having secure communications. And I think we've pointed out that those interests are privacy, and that warrants often fall far short from what you would want in terms of privacy protection, but there are also security interests, and our legal regime doesn't address in any way how encryption backdoors or government hacking impacts these security interests. So it's not much comfort to call it lawful access. And the third thing I would say is that the language about warrant-proof spaces is also a lie, because if you look at our life, most of history, humans have had warrant-proof spaces. Ryan, if you and I went and had a conversation in a field, that conversation disappears into thin air and can never be recalled. That was warrant-proof. And nobody would ever suggest that we need to write down or keep a log of who we meet with, when we meet with them, and what the topic of our conversation was. That was all warrant-proof. What's different and what's changed is the fact that that data is generated at all. And that, now law enforcement has capabilities that would have been considered magical witchcraft just like 30 years ago, that you can go back in time and find out where I was 4 months ago and who else was near me, is magical. And yet the government readily has that capability today. So my sum up of that, I think, is that technology has taken our privacy away. And now we're in a battle to have technology restore some little small aspect of it. And, they say, when you have a hammer, everything is a nail. But for me, it's the opposite. I'm a lawyer. And so I see how my tool is too weak to really address what the problem is. And I think that technology and protection of the ability to create and to implement secure communications technology is the most effective thing for protecting people's privacy and security. When a big company like Facebook decides to deploy end-to-end encryption on one of its messaging products, suddenly 1 billion people are secure. Unfortunately, the law can't do that. So I think that's where a lot of our efforts need to be, and that an important role that people like myself can play and are playing through this coalition and otherwise is to ensure that that technological development is protected and can happen.
Thank you, Jennifer. And you do make a really good point on just how ridiculous it is how much information they can get access to. Yeah. Mallory?
Sure. I think my major takeaway for everyone is that there just are paradoxes. It is just not possible to have confidential communications that are necessary for business and for running our daily lives that allow us to use the internet in literally every part of our lives now. And that those confidential communications that can then also be accessed by law enforcement in a way that Jennifer has really clearly articulated. From a technical perspective, these things are just incompatible, and there is no geeking our way out of it. If we need the technology to step in because the legal techniques are too weak, then we need that. We need that to be strong, and we can't compromise on small feature requests that seem, innocuous, or they seem like they won't have an effect on the math behind encryption. It will affect the system, and it will prevent the technical design from fulfilling its promise to users and users' expectations around all the different hard problems of doing truly confidential communications between two people, between more than two people, which obviously then makes it much, much more complicated. So I think that's the main thing. We just really need to make that clear that they're just simply incompatible, and I'm sorry, but we can't do both.
It's a really good point. And we often hear the argument from law enforcement that the tech industry just needs to nerd harder, but you can't nerd away a problem that's a mathematical impossibility. So that's kind of the situation we're in. Sven.
Thank you. I think it's one of the, from the policy perspective, I think it's one of the greatest tricks that the security agencies played that made us believe that we have to choose now between encryption backdoors and government hacking, when in fact they have been pushing it under a faulty going dark narrative for too long without ever providing any holistic empirical foundation or technology impact assessment that any of that is actually required. And I think that's something we should take away when we want to discuss it further, that maybe the solution is not either or, but actually it's really none.
Thanks, Sven. And it's a good point. And it's how much can you be going dark if you have access to so much more information than you did 30 years ago, as Jennifer was saying. Harlan.
Yeah. Bottom line, we obviously don't want encryption backdoors. That's going to make everything we're talking about here today worse. And as we've covered throughout today's conversation, cops are already getting pervasive access to people's cell phones pretty easily and cheaply. So significant harm, is already being done even without backdoors. And that harm is just continuing to grow as these forensic tools get more widely adopted. I think, maybe another way of saying this is, we all care about whether cops can get into people's cell phones, right? And because it's an encryption debate and this is Encryption Coalition, we care about whether cops can bypass the encryption on people's cell phones. But I'd also urge that, we have to care just as much about the folks who don't have encryption, right? Who can't afford high-end mobile devices with the latest security features. And I just hope that, we can expand the terms of this debate as well, to protect and to pay more attention to those users as well.
That's a really good point, Harlan. And I think that's also an important point for why we need to make sure that encryption is more is more prevalent and pervasive around the world to protect from these threats. So thank you again to all 4 of the panelists for this excellent conversation on government hacking. I know I learned a lot, and I hope the others did as well. To close it out, we're going to turn now to Greg Nojheim, who's the another member of the steering committee for the Global Encryption Coalition, to talk for a few moments about the Global Encryption Coalition and how you can join.
Thanks, Ryan. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good. I'm Greg Nojheim from the Center for Democracy and Technology, and I want to extend my personal thanks to ISOC, Ryan, and all of the speakers for a really excellent webinar. I learned a lot, and you guys are awesome. It was really great, and I want to congratulate you in front of everybody. This is the first of a series of webinars that the Global Encryption Coalition is putting on about encryption matters in different places and also different subject matters. And I want to talk a little bit about what the GEC is, and frankly, I want to urge folks to join it. We're a new coalition formed in May of last year, and the goal of the coalition is to help local efforts to beat back anti-encryption proposals in different countries. That's our theme, and that's what we've been doing. The coalition now consists of more than 120 NGOs, companies, and technologists, and we're facing global challenges. We're looking at challenges in Europe at the EU level, in the UK, which is an island off the coast of Europe, and in Brazil, India, Australia, and the United States, which is another place as well. The steering committee of the GEC is the Global Partners Digital, ISOC, and the Center for Democracy and Technology. Things that we do to kind of support our members in the local efforts: collaboration, webinars, updates to each other, technical analyses. We've got a special technical group that help people analyze proposals from a technical perspective. And Ryan and Mallory collaborated on one that was very responsive to what the European Commission was looking at in terms of a proposal that would have weakened and it could still weaken encryption. And we do webinars also, and we will be focusing on different things. We help with analyses of legislative proposals and technical proposals. And we're going to be, and in addition to the technologists, we're developing a group of security professionals who we hope to be able to put out to folks who want to hear from a person with law enforcement or national security credentials that an anti-encryption proposal is anti-cybersecurity as well, as of course most of them are. Things that we do include organizing meetings with political figures and other folks. We did a meeting with the Home Office of the UK. And again, we always have the locals lead. So for the UK meeting, it was the local UK groups that led that endeavor. Just let me give you one quick example of the kinds of things we do. The intermediaries guidelines in India just came out last night, Eastern time, in the afternoon, Indian time. And they require that companies like WhatsApp be able to trace a communication back to the originator. So what do we do with something like that? We knew these were coming. We've been in touch with the India groups. We reached out immediately to the India groups in the GEC, and we'll be organizing a flash call on those intermediaries guidelines tomorrow morning. And I'm sorry, on Tuesday morning. And we will be preparing analyses of the guidelines and supporting their work as they try to get their views out to the world. And so we're able to move pretty quickly on things like that. And I'm really proud of the work that we're doing. We break out into working groups when things come up, like there'll be a working group on India There's already a working group on Europe that's dealing with the European proposals. And I just want to urge folks to, if you think this is a worthwhile endeavor, join it. And I'm going to put the information for joining into the chat right now.
Thanks, Greg. And now we are, I think, officially at time. But again, I am seconding Greg. Please join the Global Encryption Coalition. We do great stuff, and it's always exciting and a great way to keep up to date on what's happening in the encryption debate around the world. And we'd love to work with you. So thanks again to our panelists, and thanks to everyone who joined us, and have a wonderful rest of the day or evening, depending on where you are. Thanks all.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.